Welcome to a world of dreams and bygone eras, where we embark together on a fascinating journey through the pages of history, so you can drift off to sleep peacefully, enriched with knowledge. Sparta, an ancient Greek polis, occupies a very special place in the annals of history. It stands out from other city-states, such as Athens or Corinth, which were famous for their magnificent theatres, renowned schools of philosophy, developed crafts, and innovative political experiments. Sparta, on the other hand, followed its own unique path of development, forming a distinctive culture and way of life. This city did not strive for cultural dominance or the expansion of trade routes. Sparta is firmly entrenched in historical memory as one of the most resilient and unusual polis of its time, arousing enduring interest not only among historians but also among the general public. This interest is fueled by the fact that the image of Sparta continues to live on in modern culture, language, and popular perception, and its legacy still inspires and captivates people around the world. But why is that? Subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. There are many more interesting videos ahead of you, and we'll continue onward. Most often, Sparta is associated with concepts such as strict discipline, rigorous upbringing, and unwavering readiness for self-sacrifice for the common good. In the popular imagination, the image immediately arises of the heroic defense of the narrow pass at Thermopylae, where silent warriors, scorning death, fought to the last. Sparta is often contrasted with Athens, as a polis built on completely different principles, where freedom of speech, initiative, and open discussions were valued above all else. But is that really the case? This perception of Sparta has been formed gradually over many centuries. It takes its roots in ancient sources, scholarly interpretations, and images created later in cinema, literature, and propaganda. In the modern world, Sparta appears as a society in which the interests of the state were paramount, defining every aspect of the citizens' lives. But how did this affect the development of society? From the earliest age, a person was integrated into a clearly structured system where his whole life was subordinated to a single goal, the preservation of the stability of the existing order. Behavior, thinking, the manner of acting, everything was subject to this idea. Upbringing, everyday life, and the distribution of roles in society, all these elements were carefully thought out and adjusted so that at any moment a citizen could act harmoniously, effectively, and without unnecessary reflection. But how did such a strict system affect the inner freedom of the individual? The legend of Sparta grew out of a specific historical situation. This polis was relatively small in number, surrounded by a dependent and often dissatisfied population. Sparta's security was ensured through internal organization and constant readiness for immediate action. The constant tension and threat of a revolt by the Helots, the dependent population, required the Spartans to maintain the highest level of combat readiness. But how did they manage to do this? Society lived in a state of constant mobilization. This setup allowed Sparta to maintain stability for a long time, even in the face of external instability and constant threats from neighboring polis. Sparta's military power became a direct result of the social structure, in which the army was not a separate structure, but an organic extension of all of life. But how did the army become an extension of each Spartan's life? The upbringing of children, the daily routine, the structure of nutrition and property, everything was aimed at ensuring that a person perceived participation in combat as a natural duty and not as an exceptional event. As part of this narrative, we will examine how the Spartan model of society arose, thanks to which it maintained its stability for so long, and why its experience still arouses genuine interest. We will be interested not only in the military component, but also in the social and cultural mechanisms that gave rise to it. But how did social and cultural mechanisms influence Sparta's military power? Sparta was located in the southern part of the Peloponnese, in a region that has been called Laconia since ancient times. It was an elongated valley, squeezed between two mountain ranges, Taygetus to the west and Parnon to the east. The Eurotas River flowed through the center, along which all the economic and political life of this region developed. But how did the geographical location affect the development of Sparta? The city arose deep in the plain, away from the sea coast, in an area favorable for the development of agriculture. This location did not contribute to the development of intensive external relations, but allowed the Spartans to keep everything that happened inside Laconia under control. The space of Laconia was limited, clearly visible, and ideal for creating a single center capable of effectively managing the entire plain. But why was the abandonment of maritime connections so important? The main agricultural lands were located along the Eurotas River. The soils in this region provided stable harvests, especially in spring and autumn. Summer droughts and winter cold required residents to be prudent and careful with resources. It was this character of the economy, constant, organized, and without excesses, that created a solid foundation for a stable social order. But how did agriculture influence the character of the Spartans? The architecture of the city reflected the same principles. The building developed without a strict plan, but with respect for practical logic. The buildings were built low, without frills or decorations. Central buildings, such as temples, barracks, and meeting places, performed their functions but did not demonstrate wealth. Simplicity was perceived as a sign of dignity, not as a disadvantage. But why did the Spartans value simplicity and restraint so much? The space of the city worked for overall restraint, both visually and organizationally. No defensive walls were erected around Sparta. The location away from sea raids and surrounded by mountains reduced the need for strong fortifications. The main support was considered to be the internal structure, the army, order, and collective readiness to repel any threat. But why did the Spartans abandon defensive walls? The city was open, but under constant surveillance. The system did not imply secrecy. It was based on discipline and universal suspicion. The geography of Laconia contributed to the formation of a closed, collected model of society. In such conditions, it was convenient to build a society in which everyone knew their place and task, and the authorities could control and regulate all ongoing processes. From this grew the Spartan order, not as an abstract idea, but as a direct reaction to the conditions in which they had to live. But how long could this system exist unchanged? Long before Sparta acquired its famous identity, the territory of Laconia was inhabited by people. Back in the Bronze Age, agricultural settlements flourished along the banks of the Eurotas River, closely connected with the Mycenaean civilization. These communities engaged in agriculture, built houses of stone and clay, buried their dead in mounds, and, judging by archaeological finds, were heavily influenced by Mycenaean culture, which had a significant impact on all areas of their lives. But what happened next? Achaeans, the bearers of early Greek culture, lived here. They controlled this land until the start of the large-scale migration of peoples, which occurred around the end of the 12th century BC. Against the backdrop of the general decline of Mycenaean civilization, large-scale movements of peoples began, which radically changed the ethnic and political map of the region. But who replaced the Achaeans? New tribes came to the Peloponnese, speaking a different dialect, with different customs and military organization. Later they became known as the Dorians. These people brought with them a new model of social organization, focused on combat training, closed and independent of the palace tradition of the Mycenaean era. They did not strive for luxury and the construction of magnificent palaces, but focused on creating a strong army and maintaining order in the conquered lands. But how did the Dorians influence the formation of Sparta? The migration of the Dorians took place gradually, in waves. This process did not develop instantaneously, but the result was decisive for the future of the region. The Dorians occupied the valley of the Eurotas River and began to build their settlements here, displacing or subjugating the local population. This period became a turning point in the history of Laconia, determining its further path of development. But how did the Dorians gain a foothold in the new lands? The old Achaean centers ceased to exist or were absorbed by the new settlements of the Dorians. The local population survived, but lost its independence. As a result, a transformation of society took place, where the top was made up of incoming military clans, and the indigenous inhabitants found themselves in a subordinate position. This is how a new social structure was formed, which would later become a characteristic feature of Spartan society. But how did this affect the political structure of the region? The formation of Sparta took place gradually, in stages. According to the testimonies of ancient sources, the city was formed as a result of the unification of 4 settlements: Limnae, Messoa, Pitana, and Conura. These villages were located at a short distance from each other and were located along the river on a fertile plain, which contributed to their close interaction and ultimately led to unification. But what triggered the unification of these settlements? At a certain point, these settlements united into one political entity. This unification became an important milestone in the history of the region. It was then that Sparta ceased to be a mere collection of villages and turned into an organized polis, possessing its own political structure and striving to expand its influence. But what consequences did this unification have for the inhabitants of Laconia? By this time, the Dorians had already firmly established themselves in Laconia. They controlled the main lands along the Eurotas River, and the local residents were distributed among various social categories. A new society emerged in which social status was determined by origin. But what did the new social hierarchy look like? The descendants of Dorian families were granted the status of full-fledged citizens of Sparta, possessing all political and economic rights. The remaining inhabitants, mostly descendants of the local population, retained personal freedom, but were excluded from participating in the political life of the polis. This marked the beginning of social stratification, which over time evolved into a rigid system with a strict hierarchy, where everyone occupied a specific place. But how did this system affect the development of Spartan culture? Military power and control over land became the main instruments of power in Sparta. The seizure of new territories occurred gradually, and every plot of land found a use. Land provided crops, determined social status, and gave the right to participate in the life of the polis. Land ownership was a privilege available only to full-fledged citizens. But what significance did land hold for the Spartans? The distribution of land meant participation in the Council of Elders, popular assemblies, and the army. Those who did not own land remained in secondary roles in society. The city, formed as a result of the unification of 4 settlements, had its own characteristics. But what distinguished Sparta from other Greek polis? Sparta was located on a plain, scattered along the banks of a river, and retained a decentralized structure. Construction was carried out without a clear plan. Unlike the Athenian agora or the fortresses of Tiryns, Sparta lacked massive walls and monumental public spaces. The main emphasis was on functionality, strength, and stability, which reflected the practical and ascetic character of Spartan society. But why did the Spartans not build monumental structures? After strengthening their power in Laconia, the Spartans began expanding westward. Beyond the Taygetus mountain range lay Messenia, a large and fertile region, attractive in terms of resources and strategic location. But why did Messenia specifically attract the attention of Sparta? Messenia possessed lands that yielded stable harvests, a milder climate, and wide plains. In terms of its potential, Messenia significantly surpassed Laconia. The population of this region preserved pre-Dorian traditions, and they had their own governance, economy, and military organization. But what awaited the Messenians? The subjugation of Messenia was not a formal act. It required prolonged and persistent pressure from Sparta. In ancient tradition, this conflict was called the First Messenian War, which became one of the most bloody and protracted confrontations in the history of ancient Greece. But how were the Spartans able to conquer Messenia? The fighting lasted for about 20 years. The Spartans waged war methodically, subdued the region piece by piece, and established themselves on the captured territory. After the war ended, the Messenians came under the control of Sparta. But what happened to the local population? The Messenians were neither expelled nor physically exterminated. Most remained living on their land, but lost political independence. The territory was redistributed among the citizens of Sparta, leading to the establishment of a new order in the region. But how did the conquest of Messenia affect the internal structure of Sparta? The local population found themselves in a subordinate position and became the basis for the formation of a special legal status, which would later be called helatry. These people continued to engage in agriculture, but no longer participated in decision-making and had no rights to land. The conquest of Messenia radically changed the demographic and social balance in Sparta. But what consequences did this lead to? To the numerical minority of full-fledged citizens of Sparta was added a huge mass of subordinates, tied to a specific territory but not included in the political system. This created constant demographic tension. According to estimates by ancient authors, the dependent population outnumbered the citizens several times over, which posed a serious threat to the stability of Spartan society. But how did the Spartans cope with this threat? The proportion was unstable, and the Spartans realized this. From this point on, internal security became no less important for Sparta than external defense. Constant mechanisms of surveillance, suppression, and control over the helots began to form in the Spartan system. But how did this affect the formation of the Spartan way of life and military culture? Spartan society perceived the constant control and suppression of the helots not as something out of the ordinary, but as an integral part of the existing order. Maintaining citizen status required not only participation in popular assemblies, but also unwavering readiness for decisive action within the polis. The constant fear of losing control over the subordinate population became a familiar part of the Spartan mentality, shaping their behavior and way of thinking. But how was this reflected in Sparta's foreign policy? Sparta did not strive to expand its territory for the sake of expansion itself. Its main goal was stability. However, each conquered territory brought not only new lands and resources, but also new risks and problems associated with the need to control the conquered population. But how did the Spartans solve this problem? The Spartans understood that something needed to be done about this. Therefore, the entire subsequent political model of Sparta developed in conditions of the constant numerical superiority of the conquered population and continuous internal tension. Sparta began to live like an army constantly stationed in the center of a hostile country, ready at any moment to repel an uprising and maintain power. But how did this affect the social structure of Spartan society? And the more controlled resources there were, the stricter the system had to be to keep it in balance and prevent riots. Spartan society was not divided into rich and poor in the usual sense of the word. It was divided into those who had the right to decide the fate of the polis and all others who were deprived of this opportunity. In this system of privilege, the Spartans saw the key to the stability and prosperity of their state. But who was included in this elite? In this system, the central place was occupied by the Spartiates, or those who were called citizens. There were few of them, but they formed the backbone of Sparta's political and military structure. One could only become a Spartiate by right of birth, but what did this mean for the rest of the population? This status was not given for special services to the state and was not awarded by a decision of the popular assembly. It was passed down exclusively by blood, through the paternal line, from citizen to son. Even within Sparta itself, the number of Spartiates was strictly limited, which made their privileged position even more valuable. But why were there so few Spartiates? Over the years, the number of Spartiates steadily decreased, and this directly affected the stability of the entire Spartan system. A full-fledged Spartiate held a special position in society, enjoying all the rights and privileges unavailable to other segments of the population. But what exactly was included in these privileges? He had a plot of land for life, which provided him and his family with everything they needed. The land was considered the property of the state, but was assigned to a specific family of Spartiates, passed down from generation to generation. However, others, mainly dependent farmers attached to the plot, were supposed to cultivate this land. But what did the Spartiate himself do? The Spartiate himself did not engage in agriculture or any other labor. His task was quite different: to serve in the army, participate in popular assemblies, raise offspring in the spirit of Spartan traditions, and preserve the existing order by all means. But how did the Spartans raise their children? Military training began in Sparta at a very early age. Already at the age of 7, boys were taken away from their families and placed in a special education system known as the agoge. From that moment on, they no longer belonged to their families, but became the property of the state. But what were they taught in the agoge? In the agoge, boys were taught not to express their opinions, but to listen to their elders unquestioningly. They were taught not to complain about difficulties, but to endure pain and hardship. Everything in the agoge was subject to strict discipline, collective action, and the ability to remain stable under pressure. But what purpose did such an education system serve? The Spartiate was raised as a cog in a huge mechanism of social order, as a soldier ready to obey orders unquestioningly and fight to the last drop of blood. When a boy became a youth, he had to pass a series of harsh tests to prove his readiness for adult life. But what happened if a youth could not withstand the tests? If a youth successfully passed all the tests, he was admitted to the male society of Spartiates. From that moment on, he was entitled to eat in the common mess hall and was considered a full member of the civic body. Without participating in this circle, a person lost all his political rights. But what did this mean for his future? He could stay in the city, but he was no longer considered a citizen of Sparta, losing all the privileges and rights due to Spartiates. Military service continued practically throughout the adult life of a Spartiate. But how did this affect his personal life? The Spartan system did not allow private employment or personal entrepreneurship. All the citizens' time, energy, and attention belonged to the polis. Everything else was considered secondary and did not matter. But why were the Spartans so devoted to their state? Even the family in Sparta was perceived not as a personal sphere, but as merely a link in the chain of generations, designed to ensure the continuation of the Spartan lineage and the transmission of traditions. The main task of the Spartiate was to preserve the existing order, not to let down comrades, and to pass the system on to their descendants. But how did the Spartans manage to maintain this system for so long? The number of Spartiates gradually decreased, and there were several reasons for this. Not every child passed the rigorous selection process, and not every youth could withstand the harsh upbringing in the agoge. Those who could not afford to participate in the common mess hall were also excluded from the number of full-fledged citizens. But why were there fewer and fewer Spartiates? As a result, by the classical period of ancient Greek history, the number of full Spartan citizens had dwindled to just a few thousand. This created immense tension within the Spartan system. But how did the Spartans manage this pressure? Spartan citizens continued to hold power, but their numbers were dwindling, while the number of those they ruled constantly grew. Being a Spartiate did not offer any advantages in terms of wealth. It did not guarantee a life of luxury, but imposed constant duties and restrictions on a person. But what did a Spartiate get in return? It was a status that had to be earned daily through one's behavior, service, and active participation in the life of the polis. It was impossible to shirk these responsibilities. A Spartiate had no personal freedom. He was a bearer of the political system, and that was the essence of his role, to maintain balance in a system where power rested on personal discipline and a willingness to be responsible for maintaining order. But how did the Spartans control the vast mass of dependent people? The Helots constituted the dependent population of Sparta. Their situation was fundamentally different from other forms of slavery that existed in the Greek world. Helots did not belong to private individuals, but to the state. Their status was legally enshrined and passed down from generation to generation. But how did the Helots live and work? The Helots lived on the land they cultivated and remained attached to it within the overall system of land allocation. The Helots were mainly from Messenia, a vast area conquered by the Spartans after lengthy military campaigns. But how did the Messenians become Helots? After the conquest of Messenia, most of the local population remained in their former territories, but in a new status. They retained their families, homes, and economic traditions, but were integrated into the structure of the Spartan polis as a labor force. But what obligations did the Helots have? Their main duty was to cultivate the land assigned to Spartan citizens. A fixed share of the harvest was handed over to the Spartiate to whom the land was assigned. The economy of Sparta relied entirely on the labor of the Helots. But how did this affect the lives of the Spartiates themselves? Helots provided food for the Spartan army, educational institutions, and communal dining halls. All the main functions of agricultural production rested on their shoulders. This allowed Spartiates to focus entirely on military service, politics, and participation in popular assemblies without being distracted by concerns about daily bread. But how stable was such a society? Farming, harvesting, and all seasonal work were carried out exclusively by the efforts of the dependent population. Their lives were spent in rural areas, in small communities, under the constant supervision of the Spartan authorities. Military service was not provided for Helots, but what was their daily life like? The main duty of the Helots remained continuous work on the land, the performance of duties, and strict compliance with the established norms and rules. The number of Helots significantly exceeded the number of full Spartan citizens, creating a persistent demographic tension. In some regions, there were up to 5 dependent Helots for every Spartiate. But how did the Spartans manage such a large and potentially dangerous population? Effective management of such a large population required a carefully designed system of control and repression. Sparta built this system consistently and steadily, paying particular attention to surveillance, strict restrictions, and special mechanisms of influence. But what did these mechanisms include? One of the most sinister forms of control over the Helots was the crypteia. Young Spartan citizens were trained to identify potential threats among the Helots, as well as to act quickly, cruelly, and secretly, destroying those who seemed suspicious to them. But what was the purpose of the crypteia? The crypteia was not an army in the usual sense of the word, but rather a secret internal service of surveillance and suppression, designed to keep the Helots in constant fear and obedience. Through such practices, the state demonstrated its power and constantly reminded the dependent population of their subordinate position. But how else did the Spartans restrict the freedom of the Helots? The behavior of the Helots was regulated in the strictest manner. Their movements were carefully monitored, and access to weapons, participation in religious festivals, and other public events was strictly limited. Even in everyday life, the Helots had to observe many rules regarding clothing, speech, and customs. But what did such restrictions lead to? Any manifestation of independence or disobedience on the part of the Helots was regarded as an attempt to go beyond the established order and was immediately suppressed with particular cruelty. Despite all these restrictions and oppressions, the Helots managed to preserve their culture and traditions. But how did they manage to do this? Despite all the hardships and deprivations, the Helots managed to maintain their stable way of life. They continued to lead domestic lives, raise families, and pass on their language, customs, and traditions from generation to generation. Their presence in the life of the polis remained noticeable, despite all the efforts of the Spartans to isolate them from society. But how did the Helots influence the life of Sparta? The Helots lived side by side with the citizens of Sparta, worked on the same lands, and passed on their experience from generation to generation. Their situation made them both indispensable and constantly watched. The Spartan model of society could not exist without this dependent layer of the population, but what place did the Helots occupy in this model? The labor of the Helots ensured the economic stability of the entire Spartan system. Their constant presence and the potential threat of rebellion set the rhythm for all of Sparta's domestic policy. Control, discipline, seclusion, and constant military readiness. All this was formed in response to the need to manage a huge dependent population. But what impact did this have on Spartan society? The Helots became not only the basis of the Spartan economy, but also the foundation of Spartan strictness, discipline, and militarism, defining the image and character of this unique state for many centuries. But both the Helots and the Spartiates were not the only inhabitants of Laconia. Another special category of free residents in Sparta were called Perioeci. But who were the Perioeci, and what place did they occupy in Spartan society? The Perioeci retained personal independence, owned property, lived in their own cities, had families, and could freely dispose of their labor. However, unlike the Spartiates, they remained outside the political community of Sparta. The Perioeci did not participate in popular assemblies and did not make any decisions, nor did they have civil rights. But what did they do? Their role in Spartan society was determined not by their origin, but by their place in the economic structure of the state. The name Perioeci literally means those who live around, indicating their geographical location. These people inhabited the border areas and remote lands that were part of the Lacedaemonian state. But where exactly did they live? Most often, Perioeci communities were located closer to the coast or in the mountainous regions of Laconia. They were engaged in crafts, trade, construction, and could own workshops and merchant ships. The state recognized their rights to own property, but did not include them in the full citizenry of Sparta. But what obligations did the Perioeci have? During military campaigns, the Perioeci were part of the Spartan army. They fought in the heavy infantry, participated in garrison service, and guarded fortresses and roads. Military duty for the Perioeci was mandatory and honorable. But what place did the Perioeci occupy in the army? The Perioeci had to serve on an equal footing with the citizens of Sparta, but at the same time, they did not participate in making decisions that were made after the battle was over. They could be brave warriors, but remained outside of power. Their position in Spartan society ensured that the state performed a number of important functions. But what were these functions? It was the Perioeci who formed the basis of the urban and craft life of Sparta. They produced weapons and armor, made clothing, engaged in metalworking and construction. All the economic and commercial needs of the polis were met exclusively through the Perioeci. But why did the Spartiates not engage in crafts? Since the Spartiates did not engage in crafts, and the Helots were engaged exclusively in agricultural labor, it was the Perioeci who closed all intermediate tasks, ensuring the functioning of the economy and infrastructure of Sparta. They also became a link between Sparta and the outside world, but how did this happen? Goods passed through the cities of the Perioeci, ports and warehouses were located in them, and people and materials were sent from there. The Perioeci spoke the same dialect as the citizens of Sparta, professed the same religious cults, participated in holidays, but always maintained their separate position. But how were relations between the Spartiates and the Perioeci? The Spartan system was built not on the oppression of the Perioeci, but on a strict division of functions and social roles. Everyone knew their place and performed their task. The Spartiates made decisions, waged wars, and maintained the state system. The Perioeci worked and served in the army. The Helots provided the economic base, cultivated the land, and supplied food. But how did this system work? There were clear boundaries between the different layers of Spartan society which could not be crossed. Not because it was formally prohibited by law, but because the entire structure of Spartan society did not allow such movement. The clear hierarchy allowed Sparta to remain stable and prosperous for many centuries. But what held this system together? The citizens of Sparta received the ideology of duty and service to the state. The Perioeci had the opportunity to live under the protection of the Spartan army and do their business. The Helots had a stable, albeit harsh, way of life. Sparta was held together not by repression and violence, but by a deeply ingrained habit instilled from childhood. But why were the Spartans so adamant in maintaining their order? Sparta allowed itself no leniency or deviation from established rules. Any weakening in the structure of Spartan society could lead to its inevitable destruction. Therefore, the entire system was reproduced strictly and consistently from generation to generation. But how did the education of a Spartan citizen begin? Education in Sparta began long before a child spoke their first word. From the moment of birth, they were seen as a potential part of the polis, as a future warrior and citizen of Sparta, destined to serve their state until their last breath. But what awaited the newborn Spartan? The recognition of a newborn child as a full member of Spartan society occurred through a unique form of collective decision-making. The family would bring the infant to the elders, who would then deliver a judgment on whether the child was worthy to be included in the Spartan system or not. But how did this selection happen? This moment laid the foundation for one of the most enduring and somber images associated with Sparta, Mount Taygetus. Ancient tradition mentions a place called Apothetai, where infants deemed unfit for life in the harsh Spartan environment were allegedly left. Plutarch, who lived considerably later than the events described, wrote about this. But did it actually happen? Archaeological excavations have not provided any convincing evidence of the practice of mass infanticide in Sparta. However, even if it was not about actually throwing infants off a cliff, but about a symbolic exclusion from society, the essence of this ritual is important. But what was the meaning of this ritual? Participation in the Spartan system was not automatically granted to a person by virtue of birth. It was affirmed by a decision of society which assessed the physical and mental qualities of the newborn, as well as their conformity to the ideals of the Spartan state. But what happened after approval? After approval, the child remained with the family, but only for a short time. At the age of 7, they were taken from their family and incorporated into the state education system known as the agoge. This system was the cornerstone of Spartan society, but what was it? The agoge was neither a school in the modern sense of the word, nor a military barracks. It was a comprehensive way of life, carefully designed to shape a person fully integrated into the Spartan order and devoted to their state. But how did the agoge work? The agoge began with the simplest things: a strict daily routine, the formation of useful habits, and the imposition of various restrictions. Boys lived in groups, ate, slept, and obeyed a single rhythm together. No superfluous knowledge or random interests were encouraged, but what was the foundation of learning? The foundation of Spartan education was the development of physical endurance, the cultivation of attentiveness, the development of patience, and full integration into the collective. They did not develop individuality and personal talents here, but created a universal mold capable of withstanding any stress and hardship. But why was individuality not encouraged? Speech held a special place in the agoge. Spartans did not encourage long stories and did not strive for vivid rhetoric. Students were taught to answer briefly, formulate their thoughts clearly, and speak only when absolutely necessary. This is how the concept of laconicism was born, which became the hallmark of the Spartans. But where did this term come from? The word laconicism comes from the name of the region of Laconia, where Sparta was located. The Greeks knew that if a person spoke briefly and precisely, they spoke in the Spartan way. This was not a personal character trait, but the result of special education. But how did this affect the Spartans? Brevity of speech reflected the entire Spartan way of doing things. The fewer the words, the clearer the task at hand. Spartan restraint was formed from early childhood through food restriction, wearing the same clothes, and creating equal conditions for all. The ability to speak little meant precision of thought. But why was this so important? No thought should be blurred in either words or deeds. Education in the agoge encompassed everything except the superfluous and useless. Writing and reading were taught, but did not become an end in themselves. Stories, poems, and laws were transmitted primarily orally and used as a tool for building resilience of spirit and devotion to the state. But what was most important in learning? The main goal of Spartan education was to develop character, not to accumulate knowledge. Sparta formed carriers of a certain value system, in which everyone knew when to be silent, when to listen, and when to act. But how did this happen in practice? As they grew older, agoge students were assigned various tasks. Some remained within the city, while others were sent to remote areas of Laconia. Here, their independence, ability to navigate complex situations, and make responsible decisions were tested. But how did the Spartans monitor the performance of tasks? No one supervised the students. They had a clear daily routine, a specific goal, and a set task. Task completion was tracked by the end results. This practice prepared young men for adult life, where attention to detail, the ability to observe, and maintain self-control were valued more than brute physical strength. But when did training in the agoge end? The completion of training in the agoge occurred at the age of 18. But even after that, the status of a citizen of Sparta was not yet definitively secured. For full initiation, a young man had to be accepted into a syssitia, a male brotherhood where common meals were held and important issues were discussed. But what did membership in a syssitia provide? It was participation in the syssitia that made a young man a full member of Spartan society, part of a circle of equal citizens. Only then did he gain the right to speak in the popular assembly, participate in military campaigns, and make decisions that determined the fate of the polis. But what made the agoge unique? It was all of the above that made the agoge a unique phenomenon in the history of ancient Greece. It did not simply teach young men certain skills, but reproduced the very system of Spartan society, shaping their behavior and worldview in accordance with its values. But what was the main goal of the agoge? The main goal of the agoge was not to raise a person with a set of outstanding qualities, but to form a citizen fully integrated into the Spartan order, devoted to their state and ready to give their life for it. In early childhood, the life of a Spartan boy changed dramatically, breaking away from the usual domestic comfort. Upon entering the strict educational system of the agoge, he became part of a unified community where a clear rhythm was set every morning and a new reality was defined. But what awaited the little Spartan in this community? Within this collective, a strict order was established, in which the actions of each member had a direct impact on the entire group. In the early days of their stay in the barracks, the boys experienced a completely new way of life. They gathered in spacious but very modest tents, where an atmosphere of strict discipline prevailed. From one room came the sounds of formation and quiet commands, conveyed by the gazes of the older students. But what were they taught in these tents? Here, a character was formed that was to become a solid foundation for the future citizen of Sparta. Each day began with an early rise, when the first rays of the sun softly illuminated the common area of the camp. In the morning, the rhythm was set by forming up and performing intense physical exercises where every movement was honed to perfection. But how did the training go? Training was conducted outdoors, in the vast expanses of the camp, where there were no luxuries or amenities. Everything here was subordinated to a single goal: to instill in young Spartans iron endurance, unbending will, and unwavering steadfastness, which were to define their personality. But what else were they taught in the agoge? Young Spartans constantly practiced hand-to-hand combat, practiced wrestling techniques, and learned how to handle various types of weapons skillfully. The movements were repeated with mathematical precision, which can be compared to the rhythmic ticking of a clock. And the entire system of Spartan education was built around the idea of the harmonious development of body and spirit. But how was this achieved? Nutrition in the Spartan training camp was characterized by particular austerity and asceticism. Each meal took place in accordance with a set schedule and strict norms. The child received enough food to maintain physical strength, but the feeling of slight hunger was constantly present. But why were such restrictions needed? This served as a powerful incentive to develop the ability to control desires, rationally distribute energy, and show endurance in conditions of constant physical exertion. Slight hunger sharpened the senses, developed attentiveness, and forced young Spartans to concentrate on performing each task. But how did this affect character? The child gradually learned to extract the maximum benefit from the simplest and most meager dishes, drawing from them the strength that was necessary for further training. The common space of the unit created a unique atmosphere of unity and camaraderie. But how did this affect the cohesion of the Spartans? Young people engaged in joint training, performed various household chores, participated in formations and drills. Older students showed younger ones by their personal example how to behave, how to react correctly to the slightest impulse, and how to remain collected and calm in any circumstances. But what awaited the Spartans in the future? Upon reaching a certain age, an important transitional stage arrived when Spartan youths were sent beyond the familiar camp space. The young man was entrusted with independently carrying out tasks in rural areas where the dependent population of Helots lived. This stage received the ominous name Crypteia. But what was it? The young man was embarking on a world devoid of familiar sounds and faces, where the only guide was the inner discipline and unwavering will honed through years of training. His task was to observe the lives of the Helots, to assess the situation, and, if necessary, to assassinate discreetly and precisely those who posed a potential threat to the Spartan order. But how did this play out in practice? In these harsh conditions, the young man operated entirely independently, relying solely on previously developed skills and abilities. He moved modestly along rural roads, clutching a sharp knife in his hand and carefully watching for the slightest signs of Helot activity. He had to decide for himself when the moment for intervention arrived and carry out the assigned tasks without publicity. But what did the Crypteia teach? This cruel practice instilled in Spartan youths the ability to act in conditions of complete independence, where each of their actions was determined not by the instructions of elders, but by personal judgment, honed by years of collective upbringing and training. Upon returning from the Crypteia, the evaluation focused on how the young man behaved in solitude, how correctly he chose the time for action, and how he maintained composure in critical situations. But how were the young men tested? The result of the test became evident through the absence of serious disturbances in the communities where the Helots continued to live. Only then was the young man invited to participate in the Syssitia, the communal meal of the adult Spartan community, where he finally became equal to other citizens of Sparta. But what awaited the young men after the Syssitia? The final test took various forms. Sometimes it was a difficult and dangerous crossing through a mountain pass, sometimes a survival task in conditions of sleep and food deprivation. In each case, the young man's ability to maintain complete self-control, to make correct decisions in conditions of uncertainty, and to maintain steadfastness of character in the face of any difficulties was tested. But what was the purpose of all these trials? These harsh trials became the culmination of the long and complex process of Spartan education, when the young man finally proved his readiness to live in accordance with the strict principles of Sparta and to give his life for his state. But what happened after successfully passing all the tests? Having passed all stages of Spartan education, the young man became a full citizen of Sparta. He received not only a land allotment and weapons, but also the right to participate in the governance of the polis, becoming an integral element of the Spartan system. Everything that began in the squad through daily repetition passed into the young man's subconscious as an inviolable norm of behavior, and then transformed into the maturity necessary for a fulfilling life in adult Sparta. But on what did the strength of Sparta rest? The military system of Sparta was built around a disciplined and well-armed infantry formation known as the phalanx, where each warrior was ready to die for his comrades and for his homeland. The entire system of training a Spartan citizen was strictly oriented towards ensuring that he could unhesitatingly take his place in the phalanx and not disrupt its coordinated movement, becoming a reliable cog in the formidable war machine of Sparta. But why was the phalanx so important? The army was not simply an armed force, but a permanent form of existence for the Spartan polis. Men, raised from childhood in a spirit of shared discipline and camaraderie, continued to live side by side, constantly trained together, and went into battle as a single, indivisible whole. But what was the structure of a Spartan warrior's weaponry? The Spartan warrior's weaponry was carefully designed for fighting in the tight formation of the phalanx, where each piece of equipment played an important role. The centerpiece of the equipment was a large, round shield made of wood and reinforced with bronze plates. But how did this shield differ from others? The peculiarity of the Spartan shield was not only in protecting the warrior himself, but also in the fact that it also covered part of the body of the neighbor to the left. This allowed creating a dense, almost impenetrable line in which the shields overlapped each other, leaving no gaps. But how was such a shield carried? The shield was carried on the left forearm, held from the inside with special straps, so that the hands remained free to use a spear. A bronze helmet tightly covered the warrior's head almost completely. A narrow slit for the eyes limited the field of vision, but provided reliable protection for the head from blows. But what was the purpose of limiting the field of vision? Limiting the field of vision helped to increase the warrior's focus on what was happening in front of him. He looked only forward and heard mostly his own breathing. Instead of looking around, he relied entirely on the phalanx formation. But what protected the body of the Spartan warrior? What was happening to the side and behind was controlled by those who stood next to and behind. A bronze cuirass protected the warrior's chest and back from enemy blows. It was rigid, closely followed the shape of the body, and was fastened with leather straps. Greaves covered the shins and provided reliable protection for the legs without restricting mobility. But what weapons did the Spartan use? All the equipment fit snugly to the body, did not restrict movement, and could withstand strong pressure in the dense formation of the phalanx. The spear served as the main weapon of the Spartan warrior. Its length was approximately 8 feet. It was not intended for throwing, but how was it used in battle? The spear delivered powerful thrusting blows forward, working with both hands. The bronze spearhead pierced the enemy's shield or accurately struck his vulnerable spots. The second end of the spear was sometimes reinforced with a thickened metal tip, which served as a counterweight and could be used as a backup weapon. But what else was included in the armament? The sword was used less often, mainly in close combat, when the formation closed with the enemy and the spear became impractical. The Spartan phalanx was built on the principle of a dense rectangular column. But how exactly did this happen? The Spartans lined up in several rows in depth and width, forming a stable combat mass. The front row held shields and spears, taking the brunt of the enemy's attack, while the rear rows provided additional mass and increased pressure on the enemy. But what role did each warrior play in the phalanx? Each place in the formation was of enormous importance. Each warrior knew who was standing to the right, who was covering him from behind, and on whom he could fully rely. The movement of the phalanx was slow but continuous, creating an effect of inexorable force. But what were the Spartans trying to achieve? The formation advanced step by step, maintaining its density and cohesion. This created a powerful psychological pressure effect, to which the enemy found it very difficult to prepare. The peculiarity of the Spartan phalanx was its incredible precision and coordination. But how was this achieved? The combat techniques did not require any improvisation from the Spartan warriors. Everything that happened on the battlefield had been practiced to automatism in numerous exercises and training sessions. But how was the phalanx managed? The Spartan army moved without cries, without unnecessary signals and fuss. Command was transmitted through signs, voice, and the general rhythm of the phalanx's movement. The commander was inside the phalanx. He walked with the other warriors, shoulder to shoulder, holding the same line of formation, but on what was his authority based? The authority of the Spartan commander was based not on loud orders and threats, but on his ability to maintain formation and personal courage, which he demonstrated on an equal footing with the rest of the warriors. The tactics of the Spartan phalanx boiled down to one thing: to reach contact with the enemy, withstand the first blow, and move forward steadily. But how did the Spartans achieve victory? Complex maneuvers were rarely used. The main task was to maintain the shape of the formation under the pressure of the enemy. Victory was achieved not through flanking maneuvers, but thanks to the unwavering stability and power of the phalanx. But what happened if the formation was disrupted? If the Spartan phalanx maintained the density and compactness of its ranks, it gradually pushed the enemy off the battlefield. If the formation began to break down, the battle quickly transitioned into an unmanageable phase and, as a rule, ended in the defeat of the Spartans. Therefore, the main focus was on maintaining the line of formation and preventing any breakthrough. But what qualities helped the Spartans win? Spartan life, imbued with the spirit of the strictest discipline and unwavering unity, which we discussed earlier, was built on the tireless contribution of each citizen to the common cause. But what role did women play? Warriors selflessly held the line in the phalanx, defending their homeland from enemies, while women, staying at home, supported this system by raising new defenders and skillfully managing the household. Their role in Spartan society went far beyond the usual for other Greek city-states, and this revealed the uniqueness of Sparta. But what was this uniqueness? Women in Sparta possessed unprecedented freedom for that time, which was combined with heavy responsibilities, which favorably distinguished them from the inhabitants of other city-states of ancient Greece. Now let's take a closer look at how education, sports, the right to own property, a special maternal role, and the perception of Spartan women by other Greeks formed their unique image. But how did the upbringing of Spartan girls begin? Spartan women received an education aimed at comprehensively strengthening the body and spirit, which radically distinguished them from the inhabitants of Athens or Corinth, where the main attention was paid to domestic affairs and needlework. Girls in Sparta were taught literacy, music, and dance, but the main attention was paid to physical training and the development of willpower. But why was this the case? The state believed that healthy and hardy mothers gave birth to strong warriors, capable of carrying the spear and shield with honor, defending Sparta from enemies. Plutarch writes that the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus established special training for Spartan girls, so that their bodies would become strong and hardy for childbearing. But what were these trainings? These activities had a very specific practical goal: to maintain Sparta's military strength through the birth and upbringing of healthy and strong offspring. Spartan women ran long distances, wrestled, and threw javelins and discus, participating in athletic competitions on an equal footing with young men. But where did these competitions take place? Xenophon notes that Spartan girls trained in short chitons in open areas, demonstrating their strength, endurance, and athletic prowess. Such physical exercises not only strengthened their health and hardened their character, but also prepared them for future motherhood. But what other rights did Spartan women have? The right to own property gave Spartan women significant economic power, which was completely unthinkable for most other women in ancient Greece. Women in Sparta inherited land and managed it skillfully, especially when men went to war or died in battle. But how widespread was land ownership among Spartan women? Aristotle in his writings indicates that by the 4th century BC, almost 2/5 of all land in Sparta belonged to women. This was due to the high mortality rate of Spartan warriors who constantly participated in wars. If a Spartan man had no sons, his possessions passed to his daughter. But how did Spartan women manage their property? Married women in Sparta retained full control over their dowries and managed them completely independently, without the intervention of their husbands. Wealthy Spartan women, such as Cyniska, the daughter of King Archidamus II, used their wealth to actively participate in the public life of Sparta. But what successes did they achieve? Cyniska made history as the first woman to win at the Olympic Games in chariot racing in 396 BC, hiring an experienced charioteer for this purpose. This freedom in managing property further emphasized the important role that Spartan women played in society. But what was their main mission? A woman in Sparta was revered primarily as a mother-educator of a warrior, and this role was considered sacred. Spartan women raised their sons with the idea that they should become brave defenders of the state, ready to give their lives for Sparta. Their upbringing began from the very first days of a child's life, but how harsh was it? Weak and sickly infants, according to Plutarch, could be rejected, leaving only healthy and strong ones alive, so that Sparta would receive only strong and hardy fighters into its ranks. Plutarch gives the example of a Spartan mother who, upon learning of the death of 5 of her sons in battle, said, "I bore them for Sparta, not for myself." But how did Spartan women feel about war? Gorgo, the wife of King Leonidas, when asked by a foreigner why Spartan women command men, replied, "Because we give birth to men." This phrase, recorded by Plutarch, vividly reflects the pride of Spartan women in their contribution to Sparta's military power. Women not only gave birth to sons, but also raised them in the spirit of duty, honor, and selfless devotion to their state. But how were Spartan women viewed in other Greek city-states? Greeks from other city-states of ancient Greece looked at Spartan women with amazement, bewilderment, and even some envy. In Athens, women led a reclusive lifestyle, engaged exclusively in spinning and managing the household, and their physical weakness was considered quite normal. Spartan girls, running around in short clothes and independently owning land, seemed strange, wild, and even indecent to the Athenians. But why did the Athenians think so? Aristotle criticized Sparta for the fact that women there lived too freely and luxuriously, seeing this as one of the reasons for the decline of the city-state. Euripides in his tragedies portrayed Spartan women as strong but rude and unrefined, contrasting them with sophisticated and educated Athenian women. But how did views on the Spartan woman differ? For residents of other Greek cities, Spartan freedom seemed a blatant violation of ancient traditions and customs. They could not understand why Spartan women actively participated in the public life of their city-state and expressed their opinions where other women should be silent and obey the will of men. But where did these differences come from? This difference in views stemmed from fundamentally different goals that Sparta and other Greek city-states set for themselves. Sparta sought to create a society where every citizen serves the state, while Athens valued completely different things: art, philosophy, and the strict subordination of women to the will of men. But what was the result? Spartan women combined physical strength and spiritual resilience, freedom and responsibility, which made them completely unique in the ancient Greek world. Education and physical training prepared them to fulfill the most important mission: the birth and upbringing of warriors ready to give their lives for Sparta. But what held this society together? The right to own property provided Spartan women with economic stability in the absence of husbands, and the maternal role strengthened the spirit of Spartan society and instilled in young men a sense of duty, honor, and selfless devotion to their homeland. They spoke boldly and acted decisively, not afraid to express their opinions and defend their rights. But at what cost did they achieve this? Spartan freedom existed in a world of the strictest rules and prohibitions, where personal desires and ambitions always gave way to duty to Sparta and the interests of the state. Other Greeks saw this as a challenge to their established customs and traditions. But for Spartan women, it was a natural continuation of the system we talked about earlier: unity, discipline, and selfless dedication to the common cause. Thus, Spartan women became a reliable support for their state, whose glory has survived for centuries. The Spartan society we talked about earlier was built on the tireless contribution of each of its members, from brave warriors holding the line in the phalanx to wise women raising future defenders and skillfully managing the land. But how was order maintained in this society? This strength of unity, discipline, and mutual assistance found a solid foundation in the unique political system of Sparta, where strict order and clear distribution of powers ensured stability and unsurpassed military power of the state. But how was power structured in Sparta? Sparta was famous in ancient Greece not only for its fearless warriors and their self-sacrificing mothers, but also for its unique political structure, which favorably distinguished it from other Greek city-states that preferred democracy or tyranny. Now let's take a closer look at how two kings, the Gerousia, the Ephors, and the Apella, created a complex but effective management mechanism. But who were these people? Sparta was ruled by two kings, and this unique dual monarchy favorably distinguished it from other Greek city-states. One king led the Spartan army, and the other performed important religious duties, and together they symbolized the inextricable link between the military power of the state and divine patronage. But where did the kings come from? The kings came from two ancient dynasties, the Agiads and the Eurypontids, who, according to tradition, traced their roots back to the sons of Hercules himself. Plutarch, in his famous Life of Lycurgus, writes that Lycurgus introduced the institution of two kings so that they would balance each other, preventing the establishment of a sole tyranny. But what were their duties? A military leader, such as Leonidas I, led the Spartan army on military campaigns, personally commanding the phalanx in battle, as was the case in the tragically famous Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC. The second king remained in Sparta at this time, performing religious rites and turning to the Delphic oracle to enlist the support of the gods. But was their power unlimited? Herodotus mentions that the kings possessed honorary privileges, the best seats in the Council of Elders, a double portion of food at feasts, and authority over the priests. But their decisions were always subject to the existing laws and regulations of other authorities. This unique duality strengthened the Spartan state, combining the power of arms with unquestionable spiritual authority. But who else ruled Sparta? The Gerousia, the Ephors, and the Apella formed the basis of Spartan government, effectively complementing and limiting royal power. The Gerousia, or Council of Elders, consisted of 28 respected men over the age of 60 and two kings, that is, a total of 30 people. But how were they elected? These elders were elected by the people for life for special services to Sparta, wisdom, and outstanding personal qualities. Xenophon, in his Constitution of the Lacedaemonians, notes that the Gerousia discussed and drafted laws, prepared important proposals, and judged the most important cases, including crimes against the state. But what punishment could they impose? For example, if someone violated the established order, the elders handed down a severe sentence, which could include exile from Sparta or even the death penalty. The Ephors, numbering 5 people, were annually elected citizens. But what did they do? The Ephors carefully monitored the implementation of existing laws and the actions of the kings, preventing abuses of power. Plutarch says that the Ephors had the right to summon the king to court, fine him, or even remove him from power if he violated the ancient traditions and customs of Sparta. But that's not all. The Ephors also managed the daily life of Spartan society, controlling the youth education system and ensuring strict adherence to all customs and traditions. The Apella represented a gathering of all full Spartan citizens over the age of 30. But how did this gathering work? The Apella met once a month in the open air. The people approved or rejected proposals put forward by the Gerousia with loud shouts, elected new ephors and elders, and also made important decisions on matters of war and peace. This complex mechanism effectively distributed power between the kings, wise elders, vigilant supervisors, and the people. But how stable was such a system? A system of mutual control, balance, and strict discipline maintained order in Sparta, making it resistant to internal upheavals and external threats. Kings commanded the army, but their actions were limited by the power of the ephors, who, in turn, were subject to laws developed and approved by the Gerousia. But what about the people? The Apella gave ordinary people a voice, but did not allow them to change the foundations of the Spartan system established by the legendary Lycurgus. Aristotle praised the Spartan political system for its unique combination of elements of monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. But how did this manifest in practice? The kings embodied the power of one, the Gerousia, the power of the few, and the Apella, the power of all the people of Sparta. Each year, the ephors swore allegiance to the kings and promised to abide by the current laws, and the kings swore to rule justly and wisely, which strengthened mutual trust and cooperation between the various branches of government. But did this always work? For example, in the 5th century before the Common Era, the ephors severely punished King Pausanias for conducting secret negotiations with the Persians, demonstrating that even royal power was under the control of the law. Herodotus describes cases when the Apella rejected a proposal to make peace with Athens with loud shouts, maintaining a course to continue the war. But what purpose did such a system serve? This unique political system eliminated the possibility of arbitrariness and abuse of power. Each authority effectively balanced the other, and Lycurgus's unwritten laws remained inviolable and sacred. Spartan politics were based on the firm idea of preserving the established order in the name of strengthening the military power of the state. But how did this system work in practice? The kings inspired the army and the people, the Gerousia provided wisdom and continuity, the ephors tirelessly monitored discipline, and the Apella gave ordinary Spartans a sense of involvement in the governance of the state. Plutarch quotes Lycurgus as saying, "A state is strong when all its parts work together in harmony." But was this harmony always achievable? This harmony allowed Sparta to successfully survive difficult crises, such as bloody wars with the Persians or brutal revolts of the Helots, while maintaining the stability and inviolability of its political system, while many other Greek city-states collapsed under the onslaught of internal strife and external threats. For example, in the 6th century before the Common Era, when King Cleomenes I tried to illegally increase his personal power, the ephors and members of the Gerousia stopped him in time, restoring the disturbed balance of power. But how did the Spartan system differ from others? The Spartan political system was radically different from Athenian democracy and from the tyrannical regimes that existed in other Greek cities. The Athenians gave power to the people through direct voting, while in Sparta, the people participated in the government of the state, but under the strict control of the elders and ephors. But why? A tyrant could seize power in Corinth or Syracuse, establishing a cruel despotic regime. But in Sparta, 2 kings, the Gerousia, and 5 ephors reliably prevented the establishment of autocratic power and the domination of one person. This complex structure maintained a stable balance of power, where duty to the state always stood above personal ambitions and the pursuit of power. But what gave the Spartans confidence in their order? The Spartans took pride in their unique political system, considering it a priceless gift from the gods and the legendary Lycurgus, whose wise laws had guarded order and stability in their state for centuries. Thus, the political system of Sparta created a state of the strictest order, where 2 kings led their people to greatness and prosperity, and a system of mutual control and balance ensured long-lasting stability. But what was the basis of the daily life of a Spartan? This structure fully reflected the spirit of Sparta: unity, the strictest discipline, and selfless devotion to the common cause, which we have talked so much about before. It made Sparta an example of unbreakable strength, incredible resilience, and unwavering loyalty to its traditions, whose glory has survived the ages. Life in Sparta flowed in a rhythm of strict order, where every day served to strengthen the state. But how did ordinary Spartans live? The Spartans gathered at common tables, shared meager food, lived in asceticism, rejecting luxury and excess, and found solid support in their faith and ancient traditions. Their daily life, hard work, and unwavering beliefs were woven together into a single whole, creating a unique community where the personal always receded before the public good. But what was a meal like for the Spartans? The male citizens of Sparta regularly met at Syssitia, gathering in small groups of 15 people in modest halls. Each participant of the meal brought with them barley flour, wine, a little cheese or figs, and sometimes meat obtained from hunting. But which dish was considered the main one? Thick black soup made from pork, blood, and vinegar remained the main dish of the Spartans and was a clear symbol of their famous moderation and unpretentiousness. At the table, leisurely conversations were held about the affairs of Sparta, jokes were told, and instructions were given to young Spartans, who listened attentively to their older comrades. But what happened if someone violated the established order? These meals kept all Spartans in check, helping to strengthen discipline and unity. A Spartan who was late for the Syssitia or evaded participation in it faced serious fines or even exclusion from the community, which meant the loss of honor and all civil rights. Such regular meetings closely tied the Spartans together with bonds of unbreakable brotherhood, emphasizing the enormous value of cohesion and mutual assistance. But how did the Spartans live outside of meals? The Spartans lived in conditions of the strictest asceticism, deliberately avoiding luxury and excesses in everything. Instead of gold and silver, they used iron bars as money. But what was this money for? These were heavy iron bars, specially burned in fire and tempered in water so that they had no value outside of Sparta. One such bar weighed more than 2 pounds, and it took a whole pile of metal to make even a small purchase, which made the accumulation of wealth completely useless. But how did this affect the lives of the Spartans? Their clothes consisted of coarse red cloaks. They slept on mats of reeds, and they built houses out of clay and wood, using only the simplest tools, such as axes and saws. This way of life erased all distinctions between rich and poor, from warrior to the king himself. Life in such stark simplicity tempered their bodies and spirit, directing all their strength to the defense of their homeland and the maintenance of the Spartan order. Labor, deep faith in the gods, and respectful attitude towards the past filled the lives of the Spartans with high meaning. They worshipped Apollo, Ares, and Artemis, seeing in these powerful deities heavenly protectors of the way of life they had chosen. But how did this manifest in their lives? Temples, such as the majestic sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, came to life with the sounds of solemn rites and rituals, where the Spartans made generous sacrifices to the gods and offered laudatory prayers, glorifying the divine will. But who did the kings consult with? Before the start of military campaigns, the kings of Sparta always consulted with the soothsayers of the Delphic oracle, and the priests carefully read the signs of fate in the smoking entrails of sacrificed animals. Lycurgus, whose laws invisibly guided the life of Sparta, was revered as a messenger of the gods themselves, and his rules were considered sacred and not subject to discussion. But how did the Spartans celebrate holidays? During solemn holidays, such as the famous Gymnopedia, the Spartans gathered together to dance, sing, and praise the gods and their beloved land. These sacred traditions firmly wove the Spartans into a single cohesive community, full of pride in their unique heritage and fearless ancestors. But what place did labor occupy in the lives of the Spartans? Labor played a vital role in the life of every Spartan, from king to simple warrior. Men dedicated their lives exclusively to military service, constantly honing their combat skills in grueling training and long campaigns. But what did women do? Women looked after the home, raised children, preparing them for future trials, and passing on to them their unwavering spirit and devotion to Sparta. The Helots, conquered inhabitants of fertile Messenia, tirelessly toiled in the fields, growing barley and grapes to feed the citizens of Sparta. But how was the phalanx provided for? Each Spartan warrior gave part of the harvest collected by the helots to the Syssitia, supporting his brothers in arms and strengthening the sense of brotherhood and mutual assistance. Young Spartans learned to survive in harsh conditions, secretly stealing food from the helots under the supervision of older comrades, which cultivated in them dexterity, endurance, and the ability to navigate in any situation. But what else did the Spartans do? Crafts in Sparta remained quite modest and did not differ in particular variety. Smiths forged strong spears and swords. Women wove coarse woolen fabric. But all this was done without unnecessary luxury and the pursuit of beauty. Every inhabitant of Sparta made their feasible contribution to the common cause, whether it be a brave warrior on the battlefield or a hard-working farmer in the field. But how did the life of the Spartans differ? The Spartan way of life differed dramatically from the habits and customs of other Greek city-states. The Athenians surrounded themselves with beautiful mosaics, wore bright and expensive clothes, and happily spent ringing silver coins, while the Spartans were content with simple clay walls, coarse woolen clothes, and uncomfortable iron money. But why? The Corinthians built rich ports and conducted lively trade with distant countries, while Sparta stayed away from the sea, preferring to strengthen its military power and maintain the strictest discipline. One Spartan proudly said to a foreigner, "We live so that desires do not bind us and things do not own us." But what did this mean? This foundational principle instilled equality, temperance, and an indomitable spirit in the Spartans. From a very young age, children went barefoot and contented themselves with meager amounts of food, gradually growing accustomed to hardships and deprivations in the name of Sparta's future greatness. What united Spartan society? Regular communal meals forged Spartan men into a single brotherhood. An ascetic lifestyle eradicated envy and greed, while an unwavering belief in the gods and the wise laws of Lycurgus gave Spartans a clear purpose in life. Spartans considered themselves custodians of an ancient order established by wise ancestors many centuries ago. But how did this help them? This deep conviction helped them withstand bloody battles with the Persian army in the 5th century before the Common Era and keep the numerous helots in check. Their days may have seemed harsh and bleak, but it was precisely this severe austerity and unwavering discipline that made the Spartans a formidable military force, inspiring genuine respect and fear in all their neighbors. But what did Spartan strictness provide? Life in Sparta, full of severe asceticism and continuous military training, forged Spartans into warriors ready at any moment to become a reliable shield for Hellas in a time of great danger. Their spears rose proudly to the sky, and their shields, locked together in an impenetrable wall, were ready to meet any enemy with unwavering will and fearlessness. But where did the Spartans excel the most? Spartan glory was forged on the battlefields, where they repeatedly proved to the whole world the power of unity, unwavering loyalty to duty, and inviolable principles of honor. Now, let us turn to the tragic events of the Greco-Persian Wars, the immortal feat at Thermopylae, and the story of King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans, where historical truth is closely intertwined with legends. But what caused the war? The Greco-Persian Wars became that fateful era when Sparta rose to its full height to become a reliable shield for Hellas, protecting it from the invasion of a vast Persian army. In the 5th century before the Common Era, the mighty Persian king Xerxes gathered an immense army to crush the unruly and freedom-loving cities of Greece once and for all. But who was in this army? Warriors from distant Media, Bactria and India, Scythians and Egyptians marched under Xerxes' banners, and their numbers reached hundreds of thousands. Xerxes ordered a bridge to be built from linked ships across the wide Hellespont, and his enormous fleet, like a flock of birds of prey, sailed along the coasts, threatening to engulf all of Hellas. But who stood up to defend it? Sparta, hand in hand with Athens and other Greek city-states, stood up to defend the freedom and independence of Greece, ready to repel the Persian invasion. In 480 before the Common Era, the path of the huge Persian army led to the narrow pass of Thermopylae between the inaccessible cliffs and the sea, where the Spartans decided to repel the enemy. But why there? This battle has forever gone down in history as a symbol of incredible valor and self-sacrifice in the face of overwhelming enemy forces. Leonidas, the brave king of Sparta from the glorious Aegead dynasty, led only 300 Spartans to Thermopylae. But why did he take so few warriors, leaving thousands of battle-hardened Spartans in Sparta? The might of the Spartan army could be numbered at 8,000 hoplites. But at that time, Sparta was celebrating the sacred festival of the Carneia, dedicated to the god Apollo, which strictly forbade any military campaigns. A full campaign would have violated a sacred vow, and the Persian shadow already loomed over all of Hellas. But what did Leonidas decide? Leonidas selected 300 of the bravest warriors from the elite bodyguard unit, each of whom had at least one son to continue their lineage. They were joined by about 1,000 warriors from allied city-states, Thebans, Thespians, and Locrians, bringing the number of Greek troops to 4,000 men. But what task was set before them? This small detachment was the advance guard, whose main task was to delay the advance of the Persian army, giving Sparta and other Greek city-states the opportunity to gather their main forces to mount a worthy resistance to the enemy. The fighting in the Thermopylae Pass erupted from the first day when the Persians threw the Median infantry into battle. But how did the Spartans meet the enemy? The Spartans lined up in the narrow gorge in an impenetrable phalanx, the width of which did not exceed 20 meters. Bronze shields locked into an impenetrable wall, and sharp spears, 2.5 meters long, bristled towards the enemy. Median warriors fell under a hail of powerful blows, and their light shields shattered under the onslaught of Spartan spears. Then Xerxes threw his famous immortals into battle. But did this help? 10,000 select warriors, whose name resounded throughout the vast Persian Empire, were ordered to break through the Greek defenses at all costs. They were so named because fallen warriors were immediately replaced with fresh fighters, maintaining the continuity of the formation. But what came of it? Clad in scale armor, armed with short spears and wicker shields, they rushed at the Greeks. Spears broke against the bodies of Persian warriors, short swords flashed in close combat, and blood flowed like a river across the rocky soil. The Thespians and Thebans bravely held the flanks, strengthening the overall line of defense with their pikes and shields. But did the Spartans manage to stop the Persians? By evening, the Thermopylae Gorge had turned into a huge mass grave for hundreds of Persian warriors, and the Spartans still stood firm, blocking the enemy's path. The second day of battle brought the fury of Persian archers and cavalry. Arrows rained down on the Spartans like heavy rain, but the warriors raised their heavy shields, forming an impenetrable tortoise, deflecting the hail with bronze. Xerxes' cavalry, the pride of the boundless steppes, bogged down in the narrow gorge. The hooves of the horses slipped on the sharp stones, and Spartan spears unerringly found their mark. But were the Spartans able to stop the Persians? The Persians retreated, leaving behind huge piles of bodies of their fallen comrades, and the Greek phalanx steadfastly sang its ominous song of iron and courage, instilling terror in the enemy. Xerxes, who watched the battle with anger, gradually lost patience. But why? His numerous warriors perished by the thousands, and the Spartans continued to hold the line with icy calm and composure, as if carved from stone. Every movement, every strike in their hands was honed by years of grueling training, turning the narrow Thermopylae Pass into a deadly trap for the enemy. But what happened on the third day of the battle? The third day of the Battle of Thermopylae became truly fateful. Ephialtes, a treacherous shepherd from the local inhabitants, showed the Persians a secret mountain path for a generous reward, allowing them to bypass the Greeks from the rear, thereby betraying his homeland. Learning about the enemy's flanking maneuver, Leonidas gathered his warriors. But what did he decide? He dismissed 3,000 warriors from allied city-states so that they could survive and continue to fight for the freedom of Greece in future battles. Only 300 Spartans and 700 Thespians remained, choosing loyalty to duty and military honor over a cowardly life. The Persians surrounded the Thermopylae Gorge, and the Immortals launched a surprise attack from the rear. But how did the Spartans fight? The Spartans fought with the fury of despair, aware that imminent death awaited them. Breaking their spears, they took up sharp swords, and then, when the swords became unusable, they used stones and fists. Leonidas fell in the very heart of the fierce battle, and his loyal warriors desperately defended the body of their king to their last breath. What became of Thermopylae? Xerxes was able to capture the Thermopylae Gorge only at the cost of huge losses, leaving behind a field littered with the corpses of his warriors, and an eternal lesson in resilience and courage. Leonidas and his 300 Spartans were forever transformed into a legend, symbolizing heroism and self-sacrifice in the name of freedom. But where does history end and myth begin? Their firm decision to stand to the end, without retreating a single step, was born from the very spirit of Sparta, where death in battle was considered the highest valor, and the shame of fleeing the battlefield was far worse than death itself. They delayed the advance of Xerxes' vast army, thereby giving Greece precious time to prepare for the triumphs to come at Salamis and Plataea in 480 and 479 before the Common Era. But how truthful are the accounts of this battle? However, the tales of a million-strong Persian army and only 300 Spartans single-handedly opposing it are certainly somewhat embellished. Xerxes' army numbered between 100,000 and 200,000 warriors, and the Spartans fought alongside their allies until the very last day of the battle. But what is truth and what is fiction? The oracle foretold the death of the Spartan king for the salvation of Sparta, and Leonidas's famous words, "We will have breakfast here and dine in Hades," inspired subsequent generations of Spartans to perform heroic deeds. These details may be fiction, but they fully reflect the true spirit of the Spartans. How did the Greeks honor the feet of the fallen? After the end of the battle, the grateful Greeks erected a majestic monument at the site of the battle with the inscription, "Traveler, tell the Spartans that we lie here, faithful to their laws." The Greco-Persian Wars elevated Sparta to the peak of glory and power. But what was after the war? After Thermopylae, King Pausanias led 10,000 Spartan warriors to a decisive victory at Plataea, finally crushing the Persian army. This battle put an end to the Persian invasion, finally establishing Sparta as the main military pillar of the Peloponnese. But what was the significance of Thermopylae? Thermopylae has forever remained in the memory of the Greeks as an eternal symbol of self-sacrifice and boundless heroism, where King Leonidas and his 300 warriors lit an inextinguishable fire of courage, blazing through the ages, inspiring people to perform feats. Spartan power, tempered in the crucible of the Peloponnesian War, elevated them to the peak of hegemony in Greece. But what awaited them in the future? Their formidable phalanx crushed enemies on land, and the fleet under the command of Lysander shattered Athenian triremes at sea. But the triumph over Athens was only a grim harbinger of the imminent decline of Sparta's former greatness. Allies gradually turned away from her, the forces of the state were depleted, and a new enemy rose in the east to challenge her dominance. But what caused the decline? Now, let's turn to the tragic tale of Sparta's decline and ultimate demise, where the bloody Battle of Leuctra brought an end to its long-standing military supremacy. Internal crises gradually eroded the very foundations of Spartan society, and an inability to adapt to a rapidly changing world consigned the once mighty power to the shadows of history. But how did it all begin? The Peloponnesian War, lasting a long 27 years, left Sparta as the hegemon of all Greece, but its power proved to be quite shaky and unstable. Sparta's allies, such as Corinth and Thebes, were mortally weary of the harsh Spartan yoke, and the gold of the Persian kings, generously paid to Sparta for its victory over Athens, eventually turned into a heavy burden. But that was not all. The Peace of Antalcidas, concluded in 387 before the Common Era, forced Sparta to cede control of many Greek cities in Asia Minor to the Persians, which caused great discontent among the Greeks. Within Sparta itself, the number of Spartiates, or full citizens, dwindled steadily. But why? Wars claimed the lives of the best warriors, harsh customs weeded out the weak and sick, and by the beginning of the 4th century before the Common Era, fewer than 1,000 remained, compared to 8,000 during Sparta's heyday. The army weakened steadily. The alliance was falling apart, but Sparta stubbornly clung to its former glory and power until Thebes dealt it a crushing blow. But when did this happen? The Battle of Leuctra in 371 before the Common Era marked the end of Spartan military dominance in Greece. Theban general Epaminondas assembled a large army to break the Spartan yoke once and for all. His force, greatly augmented by the sacred band, consisting of 150 pairs of hoplites, marched towards the plain of Leuctra in Boeotia. But what did the Spartans do? Sparta, under the command of King Cleombrotus I, fielded 12,000 hoplites against the Thebans, of whom only 700 were Spartiates. Their scarlet cloaks billowed proudly in the wind, their spears gleamed in the sunlight, and the formidable phalanx lined up in the battle formation customary for the Spartans, but Epaminondas outmaneuvered the enemy. Epaminondas resorted to a clever tactic. He significantly strengthened his left flank, building it to a depth of 50 ranks instead of the usual 8, and unleashed the full force of this striking wedge against the center of the Spartan phalanx. What happened next? The sacred band crashed into the ranks of the Spartiates with incredible force. The Theban cavalry delivered a powerful blow from the rear, and the Spartan formation faltered. King Cleombrotus fell on the battlefield. 400 Spartiates lost their lives, and the rest fled in panic. For the first time in its history, the Spartan phalanx had suffered a crushing defeat, and on that fateful day, Sparta's reputation for invincibility was forever extinguished. What happened after the battle? The consequences of the defeat at Leuctra shook Sparta to its very foundations. In 370 before the Common Era, Epaminondas, at the head of the Theban army, invaded Laconia, something that had not happened for centuries. The rural fields blazed, the Helots launched a large-scale revolt, and Messenia, the land of conquered slaves that had fed Sparta, gained its long-awaited freedom. But what consequences did this have for Sparta? Half of all Spartan lands and labor were lost. The number of hoplites dwindled to 2,000, and the former fear of Spartan power vanished completely. Allies in the Peloponnesian League turned away from Sparta. Corinth and Argos concluded a peace treaty with Thebes, leaving Sparta in complete isolation. The Theban hegemony rose rapidly, and Sparta finally lost its title of Queen of the Land, and its former military might crumbled like sand in a strong wind. But what was happening inside Sparta? Internal crises only accelerated Sparta's inevitable decline. The number of Spartiates dwindled steadily, not only because of continuous wars, but also because of the archaic laws of Lycurgus, which did not correspond to the new realities. How did these laws work? Land in Sparta was inherited only through the male line, but if there were no sons, the estates passed to daughters or other wealthy families. But how did this affect the Spartiates? By the 4th century before the Common Era, 2/5 of all land in Sparta belonged to women, and many men lost the right to be called Spartiates because they could not contribute their due share of provisions to the common messes. Sparta's ruling elite gradually degenerated, and the Spartiates, once fearless warriors and proud landowners, rapidly became impoverished, and their numbers continued to decline inexorably. But who could replace them? Helots and Perioeci, belonging to the lower strata of Spartan society, could not replenish the ranks of the army, and the harsh agoge education system weeded out weak and sickly youths, leaving Sparta without new fighters. A society built on the principles of equality and strict discipline gradually split into parts. But what was happening to the army? Wealthy Spartans fiercely clung to their land and power, while the poor fell out of the ranks, and the once formidable Spartan phalanx lost its former strength with each passing year. Sparta never managed to adapt to the new world, where old foundations and traditions gradually gave way to inevitable changes. But what defined Spartan tactics? All of Sparta's strength lay in its invincible phalanx and unwavering loyalty to ancient traditions. But Epaminondas clearly demonstrated to the world that new military tactics could completely change the outcome of a battle. In the 340s before the Common Era, Macedonia rose to prominence on the political stage of Greece under the leadership of the energetic King Philip II. But how did this affect Sparta? The Macedonian phalanx, armed with long sarissa spears, surpassed the Spartan one in its power and maneuverability. Philip, after crushing the combined Greek forces at the Battle of Chaeronea, sent a formidable message to Sparta. "If I enter Laconia, I will wipe Sparta off the face of the earth." But what did they answer him? The Spartans replied to the Macedonian king with only one word: if. This brief but pride-filled challenge was a striking example of the Spartans' indomitable spirit, but by no means of their strength. What came next? Philip wisely decided to bypass Sparta, leaving it in complete isolation. Sparta, blinded by its pride and loyalty to tradition, stubbornly refused to change. Powerful walls, which could have reliably protected the city from enemies, were never built. The construction of a fleet did not appeal to the Spartans, and trade remained a contemptible occupation for them. But how did this affect Sparta? The world was moving rapidly towards the creation of large alliances and powerful empires, while Sparta continued to stubbornly cling to its past, where military valor was still considered the main factor for success. Sparta's decline continued relentlessly. In 362 before the Common Era, Epaminondas again defeated the Spartans at the Battle of Mantinea, although he himself fell in battle. But did this save Sparta? This battle did not restore Sparta to its former greatness, but only cemented its weakness and dependence on other states. The Macedonian king Alexander the Great and his powerful successors ruled all of Greece, while Sparta remained apart from big politics, and its voice was gradually drowned out by new rising forces. The reforms of Kings Agis IV and Cleomenes III in the 3rd century before the Common Era were the last attempt to breathe new life into the fading city. But were they successful? Agis attempted to distribute land to impoverished Spartiates, and Cleomenes increased the number of citizens, but their well-intentioned efforts were dashed against the fierce resistance of the conservatively minded elite and the relentless march of time. The Achaean League subjugated Sparta in 195 before the Common Era, turning it into its junior partner. But what happened next? Ancient Rome in 146 before the Common Era completed the centuries-long history of Sparta, turning Laconia into an ordinary province of the vast empire. The decline of Sparta came quietly and imperceptibly. The city, born for war and military glory, could never find a worthy place in the new world where politics, diplomacy and trade played the main role. But why? The Battle of Leuctra finally broke Sparta's military power. Internal crises gradually undermined the very foundations of Spartan society, and stubbornness in the face of inevitable change completed the fall of the once great power. Sparta, whose spears once easily pierced the bodies of enemies, remains forever in history as a stark reminder that even the most impressive greatness can fade under the cold wind of a new era. Our lecture on the tragic history of Sparta is coming to an end. We have come a long way from its dazzling military glory to a quiet and imperceptible decline, seeing its greatness and learning valuable lessons from its rich past. Thank you for being with us. I sincerely hope that you enjoyed this fascinating journey into a distant era. Subscribe to our channel, give us likes, share this video with your friends, and there is much more interesting content ahead. Until next time, and may the unbending spirit of ancient Sparta inspire you to new achievements, giving you resilience and fortitude.